Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In Ezekiel chapter 9, we have a vision that Ezekiel has where some executioners are sent by Yahweh into the city of Jerusalem to execute the people and to destroy the people. However, there's a man in a linen suit that is sent to put a mark upon the people who were abhorred by the abominations that were taking place there in Jerusalem. We read about this in verse 4 where it says, Yahweh said to him, go through the midst of the city, even through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations which are being done in its midst. And you find out that that mark was to spare them whenever the execution came, whenever the judgment came there in the city. And so God was going to spare those who had not gotten caught up in what their society was doing. And this is a theme in the book of Ezekiel. We'll see it later on in chapter 18, where God makes very clear that a person is held accountable for their own sins, individual accountability to God. And we see that here even in chapter 9, where the Lord is going to spare those individuals who remain faithful to him. And this is a very similar situation to Sodom and Gomorrah. The people of God in this particular time are oftentimes compared to Sodom and Gomorrah by the prophets. But what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, Lot and his family were spared, and Lot, we're told, was a person whose heart was vexed when he saw all the sin that was going on there in the city, and he was spared. And so Lot had a similar heart to the people that we read about in Ezekiel 9 and verse 4. And the Lord spared Lot, and he will also spare these people who were sighing and groaning over the abominations that were taking place in the city. And so this can teach us a lot of different lessons. It shows us, individual accountability to God, but it also tells us that we should not be discouraged when our society perhaps begins to go in the wrong direction. And especially when we feel like we can't do anything about it. These individuals obviously couldn't do anything about it, even though they were sighing and groaning over what was going on. Still, the society was headed towards destruction and judgment. And yet they still were sighing and moaning over it, and they were still remaining faithful. They still had a faithful heart towards God. And that's true of us as well. When we feel like our society is going in the wrong direction and we feel out of control, we want our society to get back on track, but we just don't feel like there's anything that we can do about it. This should encourage us to really be concerned about ourselves and make sure that we are on track. Do what we can to try to influence our society, to be lights in our community, but at the same time, recognize that God appreciates and God recognizes those who are remaining faithful to him. And when you can't control society, at least try to control yourself and keeping yourself in alignment with God and walking according to the Spirit. And so they can teach us that. And it ought to also teach us that we should never allow society to change our attitude towards sin. These individuals continued to sigh and groan over the abominations that were taking place in Jerusalem. They may have thought, well, it was good enough just not to get involved in those abominations, but they actually were sighing and groaning over it, which means that they didn't allow themselves to become desensitized to the sins that were going on in the city and in the society that they were in. And that's something perhaps that is harder to guard ourselves against when perhaps we see sin all the time. Maybe when we see it on social media, or we see it on TV, or we see it in movies, when we're constantly in contact with sin and things that are contrary to God's morals, it's easy then to begin to not think of them as being as bad as perhaps we originally thought. And we begin to just get used to sin, and we get used to seeing it, and we get used to knowing about it. And it doesn't really vex our heart. It doesn't really cause us to sigh and to groan and to really be troubled by what we see. These people continue to do it, even though this continued on year after year and it was happening right before their eyes. They still continue to sigh and groan over it. And this showed that they kept their hearts in tune with God's heart, because God's heart was still sighing and groaning over what was going on, and their heart was in line with his. And that's what we should try to do as well, to continue to have the heart of God, to realize and recognize sin for what it is, to want to share the faith of Jesus Christ with the people around us, so that that sin can be conquered by Christ and by his grace, and so that our society can be changed. But going back to what we said before, if that doesn't happen, we still have a personal responsibility to remain faithful to the Lord. And hopefully we'll be able to do that. So hopefully Ezekiel chapter 9 will help us to implement these things in our lives, and to emulate these individuals who were still sighing and groaning over the abominations that were taking place in their city. So these are some things we can reflect on and think about as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.